Stabilization. I am extremely biased, but I am fairly confident that this is far and away the most exciting breakout session that we've got over the 2 days, because we've got two of the people that I think have been doing some of the most innovative, thoughtful work on security sector assistance inside the Beltway. That's Melissa Dalton and Stephen Watts. And then we've also got someone who has lived these issues in a number of different ways on the ground with General Caron. My name is Peter Quaranto. I am the Senior Advisor for Peace and Security Issues in the Office of U.S. Foreign Assistance at the Department of State. In that capacity, I've had the privilege over the past year to lead the team that worked on the Stabilization Assistance Review. And I also work on broader issues relating to how the U.S. government interagency coordinates and plans our security sector assistance resources. And when you total those efforts together, my colleague Raphael this morning mentioned that totals about $16 billion a year that the U.S. government spends on our support to foreign militaries, foreign police forces, and other criminal justice sector actors. And then when you add on top of that what other donors are doing, and certainly what the UN is doing with its peacekeeping, we're talking about a considerable amount of money that we are putting into security sector assistance on an annual basis. And much of that assistance is going to some of the most fragile and conflict-affected areas of the world. As you've all seen, the sixth line of effort, or the sixth recommendation in the SAR report, calls for promoting more conflict-sensitive approaches to justice and security sector assistance. The SAR highlights that the provision of security and justice and how those issues are perceived by local populations is at the heart of many of the most intractable conflicts that we see today. And so figuring out how we can better tailor our security sector efforts to advance stability objectives is a priority for us as we look to move forward with the SAR. I think as we did a number of the case studies, what we saw is that we are providing a lot of resources, both to U.S. government as well as other donors and multilateral bodies. But that assistance is often disconnected from the political strategies that we are undertaking to try to advance peace and stability and achieve specific outcomes. Often our programs are not looking at some of the more transitional aspects of the security sector and the way that the security sector interfaces with local populations. And so the purpose of today's breakout session is to hear from some experts, their perspectives on how we can be applying lessons learned in terms of security sector reform as we move forward with our security sector assistance efforts. We want to look at it from a research and analytic perspective, from the perspective of a practitioner and people who are engaged in operational efforts, and then from a policy and organizational and institutional perspective. So with that, let me introduce our excellent three panelists. I'm going to ask them each a kickoff question. I've got a number of follow-up questions that I'm happy to deploy, but my hope is that this is going to be a conversation, because I know we've got a number of people in the audience that also have rich experience and perspective on this topic, and I want to make sure we get to that in the hour. So first, in no particular order, but in the order we're going to speak, let me introduce Dr. Stephen Watts. Dr. Watts is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation and the Associate Program Director of the RAND Arroyo Center's Strategy, Doctrine, and Resources Program. His research has focused on irregular warfare, security sector assistance, coalition diplomacy, political development in the wake of civil wars, and long-term conflict trends. As I said, I think a number of us working in this space have turned to Stephen to help us think through what is the evidence telling us about what works and what doesn't in security sector assistance. And just before this panel, I'm going to do some promotion. He handed me a copy of his new, what do we call this? A report entitled Building Security in Africa, an Evaluation of U.S. Security Sector Assistance in Africa from the Cold War to the Present. I don't think you have 50 copies here today, but it will be available soon, and I encourage you all to read it. To my left, we also have Lieutenant General Marc Caron, who served 35 years in the Canadian Forces, culminating in the top position of Commander of the Army with the rank of Lieutenant General. Since his retirement, he has served as an international civil servant with the UN, working in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Guinea. He now works as a strategic advisor for the International Security Sector Advisory Team at the Geneva Center for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces. And I don't think you have a report that I can showcase, but you have many in your past. And then to the far left, we have Melissa Dalton. Melissa is a senior fellow and the deputy director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies International Security Program, and the director of the Cooperative Defense Project. Her research focuses on reinforcing the principled foundations of U.S. defense policy and military operations, and she recently oversaw CSIS's report entitled Oversight, Accountability in U.S. Security Sector Assistance, Seeking Return on Investment. I do not have copies to showcase, but I can assure you it is a wonderful report and available online. Prior to joining CSIS in 2014, Ms. Dalton served in a number of positions at the U.S. Department of Defense, particularly in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Again, I think this is an outstanding panel. I'm excited to hear from all of you. We've asked everyone to keep their remarks brief so we can have time for discussion. So I'm going to start with Stephen. As I said, you've done a tremendous amount of research on the effectiveness of security sector assistance in conflict-affected environments, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. What does the research and evidence tell us about the impact of these efforts? What are the greatest risks, and what factors are most important to mitigate those risks?
Thanks very much, Peter. Thanks for the kind introduction. I'll do my best to live up to Peter's words. As you know, Peter, and as I'm sure the rest of you know, this is a field that has been characterized by very deep and long-standing debates about the effectiveness of security sector assistance. On the one side, we have the optimists who argue that by providing security sector assistance, we can develop the capabilities and the governance of partners, allowing them to provide for their own stability rather than the United States having provided directly at great cost. This is obviously the logic in the Stabilization Assistance Review. On the other side are the pessimists who argue that, in fact, what we have is a record largely characterized by failures and inefficiencies, and where, in many cases, we see counterproductive outcomes. Arguably, cases in which security sector assistance has inflamed intercommunal tensions, has undermined civil-military relations, and or has led to more aggressive practices from the recipient nations. And both sides in this debate have particular cases that they point to illustrate their arguments. And in some cases, they even both lay claim to the same case to make diametrically opposed arguments. One of the challenges is trying to understand the broad trends in this field, to look beyond particular success stories or particularly dramatic failures, and instead see overall what is the record of success or failure in this field. So this is a really large field. I can't do justice to all of it. But we'll talk about this study that Peter hopefully pointed out. There'll be a 4-page version, which is not quite as daunting as the 100-page version that Peter showed. But in it, we used statistical analysis across all of Africa over several decades, both Cold War and post-Cold War, to try to look at the relationship between U.S. security sector assistance expenditures and outcomes understood in different kinds of violence, civil wars and insurgency, terrorism, state repression by state security services. We found 3 broad findings across these different periods in Africa. The first, during the Cold War, U.S. security sector assistance appears to have been counterproductive. It was associated with an increased risk of civil wars and insurgency. Secondly, in the post-Cold War era, the record was better in that it didn't have counterproductive effects, but we also didn't see any positive effects. We couldn't find, in aggregate across Africa, any effects, positive or negative, that were statistically significant. Third, there's one major exception to that, and that is in the context of peacekeeping operations. When there was a United Nations peacekeeping operation, we found that U.S. security sector assistance had very favorable impacts, and it had it across the whole range of outcomes that we were looking at: risk of civil war recurrence, small-scale violence like terrorism, and human rights violations or repression by the government. So what do we make of these Let me first talk about the Cold War findings. During the period of the Cold War, there was this relationship, an increased risk of civil wars and insurgencies. When the United States when the United States provides security sector assistance, in very broad terms, it's normally trying to accomplish one of two goals, either creating influence with partner nations or trying to build capabilities of partner nations. When you're trying to build capabilities, the record shows over and over again that governance is absolutely essential to this, that if you don't have good security sector governance, you're going to have outcomes that are at best ephemeral and oftentimes counterproductive. The problem is that these are, of course, very thorny, touchy issues, and most countries, most of the time, don't want foreigners inserting themselves into their security sector governance. So if you want to get durable positive outcomes on the capability side, you need to start working on these reforms that can be very difficult with your partners. If you're trying to gain influence, on the other hand, with your partner nations, then you probably want to avoid those sorts of issues, but by doing that, you're probably not helping them to develop durable security capacity. During the Cold War, the United States clearly privileged the influence side. We were trying to find partners in the competition with the Soviet bloc. And arguably we were very successful in doing that, but we did it by ignoring governance issues. And in fact, our research shows that security sector assistance disproportionately flowed to poorly governed countries in Africa, more authoritarian regimes, more corrupt regimes. And so it perhaps shouldn't be surprising that in that context, when we are discounting governance issues, that U.S. security sector assistance appears to have inflamed the underlying conflict points or schisms in those societies. This is not just a historical issue, though. If you read the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy of the United States, they say that we are entering into a new period of great power competition. If we're entering into a period of great power competition, then again, we are going to be tempted to put our influence goals ahead of our stabilization goals. These things potentially work at cross purposes to one another. So I think we need to be very careful about thinking about our priorities and the ways in which they conflict with one another in this new era. Our second finding, that U.S. security sector assistance in Africa appears to have had positive effects in the context of UN peacekeeping operations. There are a couple of ways of thinking about why this is the case. One of those ways is to think of UN peacekeeping operations as scaffolding. Modern-day PKOs normally have an overarching political military plan. They normally come with an expectation of relatively long-term assistance. And they normally come with a lot of staff members who are there on the ground overseeing and helping to implement the assistance they provide. What this suggests is that U.S. security sector assistance in these contexts plugs into a lot of scaffolding. This overarching political military plan, this expectation of long-duration assistance, a lot of people on the ground to help make it work. Outside of those contexts, on the other hand, especially in places like Africa, many other fragile states, we don't have any of those things. In fact, what we often have is U.S. security sector assistance that moves around quickly from one crisis to the next. As soon as a new crisis pops up, a lot of the money flows out of other fragile states and focuses on the new crisis, and then another crisis comes, and the money flows away from the last crisis. We've actually looked specifically at that kind of crisis response security sector assistance. We see these huge spikes in U.S. security sector assistance to these conflict-affected countries, and we see no evidence that this short-term reactive mode has any measurable impact. So we're throwing a lot of money in this reactive mode that isn't doing any good, and we're pulling it away from these long-term commitments that might do some good. The other possible reason why security sector assistance in the context of peacekeeping operations might be helpful is because you have UN boots on the ground. You have blue helmets who are providing security. And in that context, the local stakeholders may be more willing to make compromises and take chances than they would be if nobody was providing that security. That, unfortunately, again, has implications for the Stabilization Assistance Review. If we're thinking about security sector assistance as an alternative to boots on the ground, it may be, at least in the harder cases, that it's not an alternative, that instead these two things working together. Final finding of ours was that outside these peacekeeping contexts, we don't see any broad effect of security sector assistance in Africa, positive or negative. There are at least three ways that we might be able to explain this finding. One is that it simply doesn't work. Security sector assistance doesn't work at all. A second possibility is that there are particular programs, especially cheaper programs, that may be perfectly effective, and then an awful lot of inefficient spending that's simply swapping the results of those few good programs, so we're not seeing any overall effect. And then the third possibility is that U.S. security sector assistance is working in some contexts, and it's not working in other contexts. It's actually being counterproductive in other contexts. And the positive and the negative effects are, on balance, offsetting each other. So on average, we don't see any effect at all. I think each of these possibilities has really important implications for how you conduct assessments, monitoring, and evaluation. Again, very much in line with the Stabilization Assistance Review. I was very heartened to see the emphasis that it put on monitoring and evaluation and on conflict sensitivity and appreciation of the risks of this sort of assistance. I could go into details if people would like in the Q&A portion of this, but I think it at least calls for us to do a much better job on the monitoring and evaluation side. But I also think it calls for us proactively to think about ways in which contexts in which U.S. security sector assistance might be having counterproductive effects. That is to do political risk assessments, which are an enormous challenge, but I think are critical in making sure that we mitigate against the potential bad outcomes. Overall, I'll just conclude by saying, I think there's evidence that an awful lot of U.S. security sector assistance has been very inefficiently spent. But I'm not one of the pessimists. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there are indications that done the right way in the right contexts, it absolutely can be a relatively inexpensive way for the United States to achieve its stabilization goals. We just need to do a better job of keying in on what those effective ways are.
Thank you. General, you have firsthand experience working on many of the issues we just heard about, working specifically on security sector reform in environments ranging from Kosovo to the Democratic Republic of Congo to Guinea. In your experience as a leader and a practitioner in this field, what have you seen as the critical components of success for security sector assistance to advance stability goals and reforms? And what are some of the common mistakes that you've seen and lessons from our work in this area?
Try to do that in 5 minutes. And by the way, I'm no expert. By definition, I'm a generalist. A general officer is a generalist and not an expert. But I'd just like to start this discussion by just a quick definition of security sector reform. Because there are a lot of confusion out there when you are out there. People believe they're doing security sector reform, but they're doing defense assistance and so on. So security, I'll come back to the policy framework or the different policy framework in a minute. But all of the policy frameworks are all convergent on this. The security we're talking here is the state of mind. It's human security, as we mentioned this morning. That's the security we're talking about. It's not the security of the state. It's the human security, freedom of fear, freedom of want. The sector we're talking here is not the military. The sector are the security providers and the security oversighters. The oversight. So it's very broad. Okay? The legislative, the executive, the judiciary, the media, the academy, they're all part of the sector as defined in the security sector. And the reform we're trying to do, in a nutshell, is within an approach of local ownership, national ownership, as again, convergence with the SAR here, within an approach of national local ownership, we're trying to have an effective and accountable security sector. Okay? That's what we're trying to do in a nutshell. There's all kinds of other characteristics, but the two broad objectives are effectiveness and accountability. Most people just, and I'll come back to that in a second, it's a mistake we make. We focus on the effectiveness. They know how to fire the weapon, but they have no respect for the chain of command. Okay? And I could talk about Sonogo here. Everybody knows Captain Sonogo. He was the coup leader in Mali. He was trained in the U.S. I trained him also. I don't admit to it. But the effectiveness without accountability is not SSR. Okay? And the three dimension, the political one is the most important one. Okay? Again, people believe SSR is technical. It's not technical. It is political, then technical. Technical in the aspect of it's not only how to shoot a weapon or how to arrest a person, but what does it need to make an effective and accountable armed forces police force, courts, and so on. Okay? We send a police that knows how to do a beat, but doesn't know how a police force works, doesn't know how to manage people, doesn't know how to manage equipment, and so on and so forth. Political, technical, and holistic. Everybody wants to do military. Nobody does jails. Nobody does the detention system. So just a quick reminder of the SSR and the policy framework are all fully convergent. Even the security sector assistance, the presidential directive 23, which describe SSA. And I like the SSA because assistance is a good description, linked back to local ownership. Okay, I'll be back on some of the mistakes we make. I'll just the people may not be familiar with DCAF. It's one of the 3 Geneva centers that Switzerland put in place in 2000. The one I belong to, the Democratic Control of Armed Forces, the title doesn't mean anything. We're about governance. We started in the Balkans. I wasn't there, but they started in the Balkans and they moved across the world, the Middle East, in Africa, and so on. It's about good governance of the security sector. And within there, ISAT, we're a small team. We're there to support our governing board, 15 countries, to reinforce their capacity. We don't run programs for them. We just provide advice and we provide training. We conducted trends and analysis, or trends and challenge analysis last year, 2017. I'm just going to go down some of those, just the bullet. If you want to expand on the bullet, we'll do it in a question period. Okay? Complete SSR policy framework. What we've noted is that policy framework is expanding, and there's full convergence. Anybody remember the OECD DAC handbook? The big orange and black Bible? Okay, that one, and it's from, what's interesting, it's from a development organization. But they're the first one. There was some discussion in the EU, there was some discussion in the UN, but they're the one that really put out the Bible on reform SSR. There were some mistakes in it, but it was the first main one. Now everybody's got it. EU's got one, UN's got one, AU's got one. Clear policy framework. Even some of the REC, the Regional Economic Communities in Africa, ECOWAS, got one of the strongest policy framework for security sector reform. Okay, and of course, the US with the SSA, the Security Sector Assistance, the presidential directive. There's a growing investment in SSR from the last 10 years, but they are no near the 16 billion that was mentioned. And people have, ODA and non-ODA, you're familiar with that. People are trying to put SSR on ODA, but they're just doing train and assist. That's what they're doing. It's not SSR, but they're trying to put that label in there. But there is a growing investment in SSR. There's a shift towards multilateralism. In the early days, Dutch, the Netherlands, the UK, even Canada had little programs. Now people want to share the risk. They're moving towards multilateralism. I could expand on the question. We need to refocus on governance. Okay, again, lots of effort on train and equip, lots of defense assistance, but without governance, we're not going to reform this. Okay, you got to deal with the leadership of wherever you are assisting. The monitoring and evaluation gap was mentioned. We measure outputs. We don't need to measure outputs. It's outcome. How does people feel? How do you feel? What makes you feel safe in the street in Washington? The police is correct, the justice is correct, and so on. That's what you need to measure. It's difficult to measure outcomes. But that's how you'll get a secure environment. Balanced, coordinated, and holistic approach to support. That's the third dimension I mentioned. Holistic. Nobody does jail, but we all know the impact of good prevention can do. Okay, jails are not sexy. They do justice. They do all kinds of stuff. They arrest more people, but there's no jail to put them in. Okay? We need a broader view of, an holistic view of this. It doesn't mean that one country has to do everything. I'll come back to it, but it's a point of integration and coordination of programs. Rebalancing focus away from stabilization back to development. Okay, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be involved in stabilization, but don't forget development because you could prevent. If you get involved in development, you may be able to prevent. And we all know with the last report from the World Bank, the impact of prevention, how much you could save money on prevention. What's it called? Pathway to peace. Pathway for peace. For peace. Okay. Non-state actors in Africa, where I work, 80% of the population rely on non-state actors for justice and police. 80%. But we always consider, we only want to deal with the state. We've got to expand a bit. Long-term engagement, there was an example I always give is the Dutch program in Burundi. It's gone south now, we all know that. But they started as an 8-year program, okay, away from the budgetary cycle. And what we heard this morning, you also looking at I like the touch a little and listen, or pay attention. You have to know the context in which you're going into. The SDG SSR link, it's good to see the convergence back from security, development, with the World Bank report, the SDG, the Sustaining Development Goals. Another thing, we learned local ownership. That's a mistake we make. National ownership. If you don't have a state, then you have to, I work in DRC. There's no state there. People say there's no political will to change. I say there is a strong political will not to change. Okay? He doesn't want to pay his policeman. He doesn't want to pay his soldier because he knows if he's got an effective and accountable security system, he may not be in power. He keeps control, well-paid, Portuguese-speaking presidential guard. But the rest doesn't care. So there's a strong political will not to change. When you're dealing with this, we could expand in the question period. There's other ways we could do. You could get involved. Coordination, international coordination. Everybody talks about coordination and integration. Nobody wants to be coordinated and integrated. They'd be interested to see if the SAR managed, at least internally, to integrate the effort, and then internationally, if you manage it. Local ownership. When you have the political will, the other country I worked in is Guinea-Conakry. There was very strong political will to change. Okay. Once you've got that, that's the governance bit, and those leaders knows they rally their people, they mobilize, and again we can go into the details of how we did it, but that's a sure sign of success. Some of the mistakes the international made, no respect for national or local ownership. They come in here. I've got the solution for you there, Mr. President. There it is. And of course, there's no cookie cutter solution out there. You got to listen. You got to understand the context before you go. Absence of coordination I mentioned. Fighting a war as you're trying to assist in transformation. Very difficult. If they're fighting a war, they want to fight the war. Okay, so how do you balance those? Maybe we could explore, because the U.S. has been there. And I was in Afghanistan as a commander of the army, and we were trying to reshape that army with those five groups into one army. And as soon as we released them, you know what happened to those 5 groups. But I am encouraged, and you can see the convergence with the stability review that you've conducted with the lessons we have learned in the security sector reform. So in a sense, I'm optimistic. Hopefully you'll get out there and you'll manage to achieve the objective of the stabilization assistant review. But I guess the jury's still out.
Absolutely. Thank you. Melissa, turning to you, as someone who has worked within and closely studied internal U.S. government processes that shape how we make decisions about these security sector assistance resources, how do you think we can promote better decision making and actually apply some of the learning that we're talking about here? What are the organizational and process reforms that are needed to enable better accountability and oversight in this space?
Thanks so much, Peter, and congratulations to you and to the whole STAR team. I know how difficult it is to mobilize consensus within a particular department or agency around a common vision, but really kudos to you all for developing an interagency approach that you can now drive forward. As both my colleagues have pointed out, I think the intersection of security sector assistance and stabilization is really fascinating for a number of reasons. One, as Raphael Carlin pointed out earlier today, security sector assistance, like stabilization, is inherently a political activity. We are very actively manipulating the use of force, the monopoly on the use of force in another country. That is, by definition, a political activity. Security sector assistance is also, like stabilization, under increased scrutiny, both from a U.S. political perspective as well as under increased budgetary pressures these days, like stabilization assistance. And I think if we look at the track record, as my colleagues have outlined in terms of the relative success or failures of both security sector assistance and stabilization, there's actually a lot to find in common. And I'm not going to go into great detail because I think a lot of that ground has already been covered in terms of what are some of those similar lessons that we can draw. But I would posit forward, and then looking ahead to developing better processes, organizational structures, and decision-making surrounding these issues, that actually creates an opportunity to see how better conduct of SSA and stabilization can actually be in reinforcing as common processes, and thinking about them both as processes, as a way to accomplish a vision and then the different tools that are needed to accomplish those goals. I think when we look at the array of security challenges presented to the United States in the 21st century, it's clear that there's going to be an increasing reliance on allies and partners, and given the prevalence of fragmented and fragile states in many environments, both contested and in ungoverned spaces, that the intersection of these two issues is vitally important. And then starting to identify some of the mechanisms and tools that are already at our disposal to ensure better alignment of our strategic goals to the process that we're using and the tools that we seek to employ. I think there are 4 areas that already exist across the interagency that could be better woven together and tightened, and then perhaps integrated into a broader framework. And we do delve into this in the report that Peter mentioned earlier from CSIS that came out in February. So the first area is related to the Leahy laws. Been on the books for several decades. We tend to think of that as a stick to go after human rights abusers. It is a useful deterrent to prevent bad behavior and human rights violations across the several categories that are fairly transparent. I think what we've seen in execution is a need to tighten, particularly on the operational side, the communication with local partners in terms of what the consequences are, what are the impacts, but also increasingly as remediation has been offered as an incentive to allow partners to course correct, change their behavior, and reinstitute assistance is a really useful tool to think about in some of these fragile contexts where human security is very much at the core of what we're trying to accomplish, particularly in a bottom-up stabilization effort. Of course, Leahy only applies to state-based actors. So thinking about how we can enforce the principles that are inherent in Leahy in a non-state actor context comes down to framing the terms of the relationship up front with a non-state actor and being willing to hold that partner, even in a non-state actor context, accountable to those principles, and happy to get into that perhaps in some of the subsequent Q&A in particular context. The second area, as my colleagues have identified, is assessment, monitoring, evaluation. both DoD and state have some nascent pilot efforts to get an AM&E framework off the ground. DoD has a congressional mandate to do so. And I think time will tell in terms of how we're able to actually operationalize that in a way that is better integrated and culturally acceptable in a system that I think rewards more quantity, more assistance as a sign of progress, and that actually sometimes the answer to a better relationship is a calibration or a potential off-ramp over time if we're not actually hitting our objectives. So that's going to be in itself a learning process, but I think the seeds exist, the mechanisms exist already in the system to be built upon and strengthened. A third area that already exists and has been somewhat experimented with is the use of conditionality related to security assistance. We usually think about conditionality in terms of its punitive effects. A lot of times, Congress will build in legislation related to placing conditions on security sector assistance in order to achieve broader foreign policy objectives, particularly in the governance and human rights realm. I think we've seen a very mixed track record in terms of actually changing partner behavior when we've attempted to use conditionality, but thinking through how to sharpen that tool, better deploy it, requires a calculus of the degree of leverage that we have with a partner, what other options they have, how they think about assistance in their particular context and in their particular potentially fragile state situation. And also thinking about conditionality, much like with Leahy, as the flip, as an incentive. Can there be an incentives-based milestone approach to encouraging better behavior, to walk partners down a certain pathway that accomplishes both our SSA objectives and our stabilization objectives? And again, I think there are some mechanisms in place already in policy parlance and practice that can be built out in that regard. And then the fourth category relates to institution building. There was an interesting point drawn in an earlier Q&A in one of the plenary sessions on the emphasis in the SAR on systems rather than institutions, which I thought was a really, not so semantics point, an actual real point to be made in a fragile state context. But I think thinking through the mechanisms we already have at our disposal in the defense realm when it comes to defense institution building, but more broadly in the finance sector, in the justice and accountability sector, what from a bottom-up perspective can be strengthened on a pathway to creating institutions that is leveraging local means of justice, of keeping track of facts and figures on the books, in terms of local basis of accountability that can be woven together and strengthened. But I think there's a broader point both from a policy perspective and maybe even from an authorities perspective in terms of whether we have the right tools and authorities to conduct systems building, for lack of a better frame for that, but the equivalent of doing institution building in a fragile state context. But again, I think the seeds of that exist in the interagency. So those are the extant mechanisms that could be woven together and strengthened. To take a step back and think about what is the policy and organizational overlay that into which those mechanisms could play and be leveraged, I'd like to make 5 points before turning it back to Peter. And I think this is very much reinforced by the points my colleagues made earlier. The first point is to define U.S. And partner interests upfront in the SSA and stabilization partnership. It's such an obvious point, and yet we trip into these relationships and then 6 months later get around to actually finding out that we don't have alignment in terms of what our interests or objectives are. So spending a little bit of time up front to do that internal reflection ourselves, have the conversation with the partner to see where we line up in terms of our interests, our expectations, not only from a security perspective, but also from a political perspective, as we've been seeing playing out in the Syrian context, can be quite problematic if those don't line up. And if there's a gap, if there's a delta, which inevitably there will be to have the internal USG conversation about what are our off-ramps, what are the red lines, at which point this relationship is not going to make sense if a partner makes certain choices or pursues certain political objectives in a way that is not consonant with U.S. interests and objectives. The second point in this framework would be to, again, spend a bit more time up front, taking a deep breath and conducting a baseline assessment of the partnership to understand the political will, the capabilities of the partner country, their expectations, their sources of legitimacy, before we pull the trigger on either our SSA or stabilization matters. I think the intelligence community can be quite helpful in this regard, and in sending a policy demand signal to the intelligence community on the importance of doing green force analysis of our partners. We're very good at red and blue analysis, not so strong on the green from time to time. And then also opening the door early in the process to the engagement with civil society and the NGO community that oftentimes can have very helpful insights in terms of local dynamics on the ground. How is that particular security force perceived in the community in ways that could help or harm our objectives? And then what are the second and third order effects of moving forward with an SSA and or stabilization stream is vitally important. The third point of this framework would be to identify our SSR and stabilization goals that are going to work for both the United States and the partner, and to endeavor to have them be SMART objectives, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely, as colleagues at RAND have emphasized. And I think here, again, emphasizing the importance of interagency, cross-sectoral, and ground-level input is really important to make sure that our objectives are selective and targeted in the spirit of the SAR, but making sure that that is also reflected in SSA inputs to this process. Doing the priority assessment, weighing short-term versus long-term, and developing plans for mitigation or exceptions if certain policy objectives end up overriding others. As Stephen alluded to earlier, there are going to be times when what we want to do with our SSA activities is not going to square up with what we want to do with our stability operations, and identifying up front where those objectives are reinforcing, where they're going to conflict, and then developing the mitigation measures to enable us to deconflict as we go, or have an honest reflection that, at the end of the day, in this particular context, we are going to have to prioritize this objective over the other, and ensure that there's clear communication to all USG stakeholders that is the level of prioritization, as well as communicating that to the partner, so we don't trip into instances of miscommunication that can have broader effects. The fourth point in the framework would be to develop an accountable plan for executing the set of activities, and within the context of a theory of change. So marking from what your desired outcomes and objectives are, and building in specific milestones to get there, but to the point made earlier in the plenary session that there is accepted failure on a pathway to success, and that we can allow for that evolution and learning process as we go, to ensure that there's clear communication within the U.S. government, with Capitol Hill, with our partners, that yes, we are going to stumble at points, but that is an acceptable part of how we get there. And with our assessment, monitoring, evaluation, being able to calibrate and adapt our plan along that theory of change as we progress. And that actually bleeds into the fifth point, which is executing an adaptable stabilization plan that allows for that experimentation and good communication with all stakeholders. So I will leave it there and turn it back to Peter.
Great. Well, thank you all. I think there's a number of kind of key themes that cut across each of your presentations in terms of kind of deliberate planning, being clear of what we're trying to accomplish, what our goals are, what our competing agendas are, trying to be upfront about the risks and grappling with those more proactively, thinking about how our efforts are integrated and how we're working with our partners. I've got, as I said, a number of questions that I want to ask, but I'm not going to be so selfish as to insist upon them to start. We've got about 15 minutes remaining, so I want to open it up to folks in the audience. We can take a couple of questions or brief comments.
Stacia George with Chemonics. One clarification, Stephen, I'm just curious, in the results you were stating in the analysis done on security sector assistance, per the definition of security sector reform, did that include looking at the full gamut, including like parliamentary and civil society oversight and justice sector? And if it did it make any difference the combination of the type of support that was provided during those periods of time? And then my second question is related to one of the things I've managed is the Security Sector Governance Project for USAID, which supports the Security Governance Initiative recently created in the last 2 years. And I'm curious, from experts' opinions, as well as Peter, from your perspective with this new SAR, what does that mean in terms of the Security Governance Initiative? Will this continue, is this a good path? Bringing together all the agencies and setting up joint strategies with host governments. What's your opinion, both from what we've seen in terms of results, but also how that will look in the future, you think?
Thanks, Stacia. Those are great questions. Let's take one more. We can take those two. Sure.
Sure, hi, this is a little fair for you. So as we talk about governance of security sector reform, security sector assistance, how do you, or I'm curious on your thoughts as far as the competing governance of that, or the competing factors. So if you take an example in El Salvador or anywhere in Central America, governance 13, and how there's competing structures. Or if you look at Colombia and Meta, where there were competing security sector structures that the FARC were instituting. How do you see the reform or the assistance vis-a-vis those challenges, and should it be an insulated? Should it be an insulation? Should it be competing? Should it be all those different matters that we do? I think we kind of conflated some of those solutions. So just curious on your thoughts on those.
Great. Stephen, did you want to kick off?
Sure. Stacey, let me respond to your question. The answer is going to be disappointing. We were very disappointed. One of the biggest challenges that we encountered, interestingly, was not on the side of getting data on Africa itself, on all contextual factors. It was in tracking down good data on the U.S. side. Trying to get good, reliable data over extended periods of time, broken down by program or by type of program, in U.S. security sector assistance is shockingly difficult, which may come as no surprise to many of you. I will admit that I had seen a lot of those challenges before, but even with a full press effort, working closely with a lot of the people collecting this data, we could not break it down by any meaningful conceptual category in ways that we could analyze large numbers of countries over large periods of time. So we weren't able to break it out the way that we wanted. All I can say is that the patterns that we found, I think, are consistent with essentially a security sector reform approach to these issues, or an approach similar to the Security Governance Initiative, where governance has to come front and center, where you need this comprehensive long-term plan and so on. The fact that we found these positive effects in the context of UN and only UN peacekeeping operations, not elsewhere, is at least consistent with that theory of change, but we don't have precise data to back it up.
On the SGI, I would have thought that we would have heard SGI before this morning. Because to me, I use it as an example. As a good example, it's a good project, and hopefully it will continue. That's my only observation on SGI. On the question, in Latin America, South America, I got no experience. However, in South Sudan, in Burundi, in East DRC, you need to consider all of them because they all play. The CNDP or the M23 right now in Eastern Congo, they provide security to a community. The FDLR provides security. You need to consider that. you need to be politically sensitive to what you're doing, because you don't necessarily don't want to burn all of your bridges with the legitimate authority, political authority. But the only advice I would say is, again, no experience in Latin America, but after you need to consider all of those players. What do they bring? And it's part of knowing the context. Okay? What do they bring? How do you get them involved, and in what you're trying to? Don't forget, you're trying to support somebody. Are they in their plan of the country that you're supporting or advising or assisting? Are they considering? And the advice, I would say, you provide the advice that you need to consider all of those players. That's all I would say.
Just a couple of quick follow-ups, to add on to Stephen first on the transparency of data. So interestingly, Congress required DoD for the first time in the budget that was just released in February to be transparent about its security cooperation dollars. For years, it was tucked away in the operations and maintenance accounts of individual services or DoD components, and now you can actually see the security cooperation dollars. It's not perfect. Hopefully next year will be better, but I wonder if there's a lesson to be learned there in terms of the usefulness of being a bit more transparent. There's always a double-edged sword potentially to doing so, particularly in this particular political and fiscal environment. But in some ways, if particularly if couched in a broader reform effort, could be quite useful in enabling us to see where the dollars are going, for what purpose, and what the alignment is to strategy. To the point on conflicting objectives and actors, completely second the importance of doing some network analysis of the different stakeholders in a country, and I think that is in part the responsibility, as I noted earlier, of the intelligence community could be helpful in that regard. But much as I think PPD 23 was trying to empower country teams to really develop a country strategy, a mapping of the context into which U.S. government activities are being conducted, that if there's some synchronization that the ambassador spearheads on the ground in terms of here are our priorities, here are the people that we can actually work with to accomplish those priorities, and then that's fed up into a policy process to help deconflict across different countries in the region, if there are trans-regional issues, that might be part of the answer from a policy and process perspective.
Just a related point that comes to mind is I didn't mention it when I read one of the things we picked up on our trends and challenges is training, greater training in the SSR, but not necessarily at the right level. We saw that SRSGs and EU delegation ambassador still consider this particular process or approach. To me, it's an approach. It's a doctrinal approach to security sector reform. In their mind, that was technical. They didn't want to deal with it. And maybe you have some ambassador here that believe that. So they need to be aware of this approach, which is fundamental. If the ambassador or the SRSG or the EU head of delegation is reluctant to engage with his kind of or counterpart at the political level, he ain't going anywhere. So that may be related.
Yeah, I want to just highlight two quick things. One, on the last question, I think the added challenge that we have in our current counterterrorism-focused environment is that many of the non-state armed groups that are operating in these environments are sanctioned, both from the standpoint of U.S. law as well as from the standpoint of UN sanctions. And I know Stacia can relate from her time working on the counter Boko Haram problem set. There's been a lot of internal discussion, and I think discussion around, across the international community, trying to think about where is it appropriate for us to be doing more with regard to the disengagement and reintegration of former combatants and associated persons with some of these groups that are on the security landscape, and how do we ensure that we have the right kinds of authorities and flexibilities. And I will say, to date, that remains a very constrained environment, which I think you're hitting on a major issue that I think is something we need to grapple with in this. on security governance initiative, I mean, what I can say is I have no great foresight into SGI, the program, and whether it will be kind of given funding to expand the number of countries where we're doing quote-unquote SGI. But what I can say is I do think a lot of us working in this space have appreciated that there's been some tremendous learning through SGI, the approach. A lot of the things that we've talked about on this panel have been part of the way we've operated in SGI from the standpoint of planning and then kind of coordinated assessment, monitoring, evaluation. So one of the things that my office is doing with other stakeholders at the State Department is looking at how do we take some of those principles and best practices and actually streamline them kind of throughout how we operate. We've got 5 minutes remaining. Final burning, we're going to call this the lightning round. So, final burning questions, please, go.
Sir, you mentioned, Melissa Lloyd from Moderator International. Sir, you mentioned working with political actors that have political will to not change, and that you could expand on that bullet. I'd be interested in that expansion.
Great.
A lot of our approaches focus on sort of bilateral approach to SSA, SSR, but a lot of the, or some of the problems that exacerbate stabilization and SSA challenges are transnational criminal organizations taking a role, creating countervailing security apparatuses. I'd be curious to learn the lessons of your research to sort of a regional SSA, SSR approach to help us as we sort of focus bilaterally in SSA and stabilization. Thank you.
Caron factor. So when you mentioned about the Leahy vetting, because as we approach things, when I was at SOCOM, part of the thing with the Leahy vetting is that there could be governance changes, that unit could have different commanders, but it's forever being held against that entity. So how do we reform that to make it to where we actually can work with certain people and it's not forever held against them, and we have this reform policy to be able to look at the Leahy. Thank you very much.
Last one.
Hi, Bronwyn Morrison with Texas Consulting. As someone who worked in the field in national security assistance in Somalia, I welcome these recommendations greatly. Just a question on sort of the process of the SAR and its briefing within the state, within the Department of Defense, and within USAID, and to make the audiences of these recommendations to make possible decisions on moving forward.
Great. Well, why don't we just, we'll start with Melissa, we'll run down the table, and I'll finish us off.
Sure. So on the Leahy question, I think over the last couple of years, the U.S. government has been trying to develop kind of a more forward-leaning policy on remediation as the way to address the problem that you're mentioning. And I know there's been some successful cases of remediation in Mexico. There are cases currently under review related to Afghanistan, but it's still early in the policy implementation. But I think the degree to which Leahy can begin to be viewed as that more holistic tool will be really valuable for the dynamics that you're talking about, particularly as we have longer-term investments with particular partners, enduring interests there that are going to compel us to have to work with the partners that we have. So I think, hopefully more to follow on that, and the degree to which there can be feedback loops from the combat commands to main DoD and with state, in terms of how to improve that process. I think it would help everybody greatly. And then on the transnational question, I think there's been some level of introspection, but not forward movement in terms of trying to be a bit more rigorous in regional prioritization of threats and then alignment of activities because of some of the built-in bureaucratic and organizational challenges of how our government is organized in DC and then the executing arms in particular theaters. But I think the degree to which that can be highlighted as a policy priority for the need to look more at these transnational phenomenon and force a conversation within regional bureaus at state and the comparable ASD-SHUP at DoD in terms of how to address this issue across our region, and then how do we need to prioritize within specific countries to address that challenge. I think it needs to come from DC in order to see the effects in the field?
So I'll address the question about transnational challenges and regional approaches. I think it's an incredibly important one. It's also a very difficult one, which isn't particularly helpful. We see all sorts of evidence of spillover effects throughout regions, these transnational networks that are critically important to tackle. I think one of the, certainly we could talk about the need to coordinate both within the United States government at the regional level, regional bureau level on the State Department side, GCCs on the DoD side. But aside from all of those challenges, I think what makes it really difficult is that if we say governance is absolutely central to getting durable results in the security sector, governance happens at the level of individual states. It doesn't happen regionally. And so even if you want to implement a regional strategy, you're going to have some countries with whom you work well, you have the right relationships, you can get the reforms you need, and others where you can't. And I don't think it makes sense to try and implement this regional strategy with partners that just aren't going to be good partners for what we know you need to get durable results. And so that's inherently going to be really, really frustrating. You're not going to be able to implement a regional strategy that you want to implement. I think one of the lessons that we should take from this is, again, this focus on long-term relationships. In some of my discussions with geographic combatant commanders, they will talk about, no, the threat, the problem is here in this particular country. At which point you say, yes, but if you think about this as a regional issue, there are all sorts of other countries that could be playing a buttressing role that could help to intercept lines of communication, play all of these other lesser roles, and we need to think about investments in those countries before you have a major crisis, rather than simply reacting to crisis.
Very quickly, I'll just address the lack of political will for this. First thing I would say, don't subcontract the political dimension of it. Don't sub. Too many times we see a subcontractor and not the ambassador or the. Don't sub. The next thing is use, again, experience in Africa, okay? Use the Rex, or use the clever ambassador. Again, DRC. All of those ministers, all of them, they go to South Africa for medical. They go to, you know what I'm saying, okay? They go for their education of their children to South Africa. Use the clever ambassador to show the incentives of, remind them of the Constitution. Again, the countries that I worked in, there's probably the best Constitution I ever read. They just don't respect it. But remind them about human rights. Remind them about, again, you work, and some of the, not the hardest case like DRC, but some others will see the incentive. You say, look, you respect human rights, you ensure that you've got proper governance here, and let your legislators do the work, and you'll have business coming in. You'll have more business coming in. So work on those incentives, try to convince them. In the end, if it doesn't work, my advice I gave my SRSG in Congo, I said, work on education, work on health. He said to me, this is not SSR. It may not be SSR now, but eventually it will be. With the education of people, you create the environment, work with again, you have to be careful, politically sensitive, work with the opposition, trying to find a champion and trying to see where it goes. But, so that was my advice to my SRG, and then I said goodbye. DRC is a tough case. But there are some others that we did manage to convince.
So, in wrapping up, just briefly on your question of socialization, there is an active process ongoing to not just socialize the results of the SAR frameworks, our report, kind of across state, USAID, and DoD at various levels, but also to engage all the stakeholders. And how do we institutionalize this into our existing planning and resource process? Because I think where we will ultimately be successful is if when people who are getting together to plan security sector assistance, for example, for Somalia, are saying, how do these principles help to shape decisions we are going to make? That's where we want to get, and that's what we are aiming for. I want to say thank you to our three panelists and to all of you. I think this has been a great session. Plenty more we could discuss. One thing we'll do is we'll work with the organizers to make sure that some of the reports that we cited here today and some of the materials that the organizations have are available to everybody who's been part of the symposium. Again, we appreciate everybody's time. We are in the 2 to 2:15 breaking and moving period. So please break and move. Thanks.